Welcome to today's webinar session entitled Conversations with GIA, Experienced Helping Hands, Engaging Older Volunteers to Serve Children and Youth. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. When you joined today's webinar, you selected to join either by phone call or computer audio. If for any reason that you prefer to change your selection, you can do so by accessing your audio pane in the control panel. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing those questions into your questions pane of the control panel. You may send your questions in at any time, and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce John Feather, CEO of Grantmakers in Aging and moderator for today's event. John?
Thank you, Kat. I'm delighted that so many of you have joined us today for this important presentation. We want to thank the John A. Hartford Foundation, whose continuing support allows us to provide our Conversations with GIA series free of charge to our audience. As our society ages and older adults face social isolation and related health issues, we can enlist these experienced helping hands to engage in their communities. The benefits are exponential when the talents of these older adults are leveraged in service to the younger population. In a survey of nonprofit organizations, the Eisner Foundation found that older volunteers were often the most valuable to an organization, but certain management techniques worked better than others. During this webinar, you'll learn about the key findings from this survey and the techniques that Encore.org partners and others are already implementing to best engage older volunteers. We're so pleased to have two experts with us to talk about this issue. Michelle Hines is the Strategic Director, Program Development for Encore.org's Generation to Generation campaign, or the Gen to Gen campaign, as you'll hear it called. Previously, Michelle held key leadership roles in three other Encore.org initiatives: Experience Corps, which is now the AARP Experience Corps, the Purpose Prize, and the organization's annual convening for Encore leaders. Trent Stamp is the CEO of the Eisner Foundation and has been since 2008. He is a recognized national leader in the field of aging, serving on the board of Grantmakers in Aging and the Milken Institute's Center for the Future of Aging. Previously, Trent was the founding president of Charity Navigator. Welcome to you both. As Kat mentioned, we will be having questions at the end of our presentation part, so please at any point type the questions in on the right side on your screen under the question box, and I will read them to our presenters at that point. So at this point, Trent, we'll turn to you, and could you help us walk through some of the work that the Eisner Foundation has done and why it's engaged in this issue?
Thank you, John, and also thank you to our great friends at the John A. Hartford Foundation for making this session possible. So at the Eisner Foundation, we focus on intergenerational solutions to society's problems. This would be the first slide. In 2015, after almost 20 years of investing in organizations serving older adults and children separately, we made the decision to shift our focus to solely funding intergenerational organizations and programs. We had already seen growing success in this space, and we wanted to encourage more of these efforts, especially because the data that we have seen shows that both old and young face challenges in our society that these programs can efficiently address. Next slide, please. So, as you all likely know, the number of adults over 65 is going to double by 2050. Today, high proportions of that population face social isolation, which is linked to a range of health issues. At the same time, 1 in 5 children in our country live in poverty, and the education gap between rich and poor children continues to grow. The promise of intergenerational programs lies in bringing these two groups together for mutual benefit. While intergenerational models range from all kinds of different things, from shared sites to mentorship programs, today we'll be focusing on organizations that work to bring in older adults to volunteer with children. Older adults have a lifetime of experience and skills to share with these children, and as they engage in their communities, they report improvements in their overall health. Collectively, increasing a child's lifetime prospects and improving the well-being of seniors can strengthen our society. Over the past year, we've been speaking in depth with our grantees who have seen great benefits from having senior volunteers. Across the board, we heard that older volunteers are often the most patient, the most dedicated, and in effect, they are the best volunteers that you can recruit for your organization. Next slide, please. So we conducted a survey and found that organizations with older volunteers have higher retention rates. In fact, almost half of the organizations with high proportions of senior volunteers retained their volunteers for 5 years or longer, which is something that every organization that relies on volunteers is seeking. Organizations with a staff member dedicated to coordinating volunteers also had strongest retention rates. Finally, those organizations that expressed appreciation regularly also kept their volunteers longer. Asking for feedback, calling or writing thank you notes, and holding volunteer appreciation events helped retain those volunteers for 5 years or more at 71% of the organizations. With those stats in mind, we came up with 9 key recommendations for organizations who want to bring more of these valuable volunteers in, and we published those recommendations and the survey findings in a handbook available on our website called Experienced Helping Hands, and we'll share that link with you later. This handbook and the recommendations in it are the basis for today's webinar. We'll begin exploring it in a few minutes, but first I do want to hand it off to Michelle to talk about Encore.org's Generation to Generation campaign and their efforts to increase volunteerism for adults over 50. Michelle?
Thanks so much, Trent. Yeah, that doesn't roll off the tongue, does it? Encore.org's Gen to Gen campaign. Thanks so much for the opportunity to talk with all of you about the Gen to Gen campaign and to give some examples from our work that illustrate some of the key points in Eisner's Experienced Helping Hands guide. The campaign is basically about bringing older and younger generations together. And more specifically, over the next 5 years, our intention is to mobilize 1 million people, 50 and older, to help kids thrive. If you look back at the statistic that Trent just offered about the percentage of United States children in poverty, it's very clear that many children could use a lot more champions in their lives. And so if you look at the next slide, you'll see something that our founder, Mark Friedman, often says about our work, that the goal of later life isn't to be young, it's to be there for those who actually are. And showing up for others is a great antidote for challenges like social isolation and loneliness, which both John and Trent have mentioned, and which you've probably been seeing in a lot of recent news stories and research, if that's something that you're watching. So if you look at the next slide, we're working on 3 different fronts. We're trying to shift the culture, change people's hearts and minds, and make the norm that Mark's quote illustrates something that everybody kind of takes for granted in a way that isn't true in our society today. We're working with organizations like all of you to promote effective practices, to showcase good work that's already going on, kind of to spread the word. And we're building more and more leaders, people who are champions of this big idea and of these best practices, both spreading the word and spreading the work, I like to say. And so on the next slide, one of the things that you'll see is some of the 135 partners, including our funders, and some of you on this call who are helping make all 3 of those aspects of the campaign come to life and who are all part of helping make it true that 1 million people will raise their hands and say, yes, I want to help the next generation succeed. And the last thing I'm going to say before handing this back over to Trent, if you look at the next slide, is there's some great news from a research perspective about the opportunity that is in front of all of us who want to connect experienced talent, older adults, with the next generation. This is just a tiny piece of some new research that Stanford and Encore.org released a couple of months ago. It's a nationally representative survey of nearly 1,200 older adults from their 50s to their 90s. And if you look at that nationally representative population, nearly half of people aged 50 to 90 say they always or often try to help young people achieve their potential. So that's just a huge amount of talent that is already inclined to say yes to the kinds of things that all of us on this call are trying to make happen. And what we need are to give them opportunities to do it. And the Eisner Handbook helps point the way in that direction. So Trent, I'm handing back to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. So let's go to the next slide and let's figure out exactly what now. Let's get to the nuts and bolts here, because this has to be practical materials. So as we mentioned, the Eisner Foundation has 9 key recommendations for organizations seeking to bring in more older volunteers from our handbook. These are broken up into 3 general areas of concern that we call cause, community, and comfort. And for each of these 3 areas, Michelle has some great examples from the Generation to Generation campaign. Look, I've got it now, that illustrates just how important these considerations are. So right away, we jump to cause. We'll start here and we'll talk about how to recruit these volunteers, because people want to know nuts and bolts. How do I get these people in the door if they're such great volunteers and there's value to bringing them into my organization? Organizations shouldn't wait to be discovered. They should make their cause known to the people likely to be interested in it. By leveraging word of mouth and relevant networks, organizations can find a wealth of talent waiting to get engaged. One way to get those folks in there is by working through existing volunteers. These can be organizations' greatest champions, so a volunteer manager should let them know if they need more of them. Oftentimes people are working in isolation and they have a ton of great friends at home that would love to help, but they don't know that they should go ahead and reach out and bring them in also. Appeals from friends will always carry more weight. Additionally, many professional networks like teachers unions, corporate HR departments communicate regularly with their members and can include your call for volunteers in a newsletter. For those who might not have time yet, getting an organization in front of them early puts it in front of mind when they do indeed have time. And finally, organizations should go where seniors and volunteer bases are. Senior centers are an obvious choice, but also consider university alumni groups and initiatives like Encore.org's Generation to Generation campaign. With those 3 early, quick, easy recommendations, I'll turn it back over to Michelle to talk about how she's seen these tactics work effectively in her work.
Thanks, Trent. So I think we're going to take a look at the next slide. Thank you. So first of all, I want to emphasize a couple points, Trent, that you just made. First of all, word of mouth, word of mouth, word of mouth. No matter how much technology helps us, friends inviting friends, people inviting their sisters and brothers or folks they go to church with, continues to be one of the top ways that particularly people in this age group are recruited into volunteer roles. So, and Annette's story is a great illustration of a couple different points. So one of the things that the Eisner Handbook really emphasizes is that collaborations with local and national organizations, including places like university alumni groups, can really help you recruit the kinds of folks that you're looking for. So Annette Schrager, who now lives in Maricopa County, Arizona, spent a long career as a teacher and principal on the East Coast of the United States. And she moved to Arizona to take care of her family. She had a brother and a mom who were both aging and in ill health, and for a while that was her focus. But when she kind of picked her head up and had more time and wanted to get involved in this new community that she had adopted as home, she went to a local kind of hub organization for volunteers called Experience Matters. And through Experience Matters, she found a position with AmeriCorps. If you take a look at the next slide, you will see Annette's transformation to AmeriCorps tutor in, is she in a middle school? I think she works in a middle school 2 days every week, tutoring students in reading, math, and writing. And we often think of AmeriCorps as a resource that is for younger people, but I want to remind folks that this is a national opportunity that's available for all ages and in nearly every community in the United States. So through this local organization, Annette got connected to a national community of AmeriCorps members, and she is using her skills as an educator to tutor students in reading, math, and writing. And she says, this is what makes my day. I've done it for 3 years. The teacher at one of her schools always has the students write thank you notes. And she says, when I read their comments, I know that I'm doing something that's making a difference. So this is something that's a really positive, satisfying experience for her. She knows that she's having impact. These are all things that really contribute to retention. And she's using her previous professional skills. If you read her whole story, and you can shift to the next slide, you'll see that she has been in this position already for 4 years and intends to stay. So, Trent, I'm handing back to you, but do you want to emphasize any other points about Annette's story that caught your attention about cause?
Only that she looks terrific in that jacket. She looks natural and ready to go, and I think it's a great example of bringing in somebody who is not just the old anecdote that I know that John Feather has talked about at GIA is the kindly grandmother who reads to the kid in the classroom, and there's great value in that. But clearly Annette is a dynamic leader who has a ton of real-world skills to volunteer to the world, and it's a shame if we don't get her back into the workforce to mentor and work with kids. And so connecting to her through her existing networks is a fabulous way to bring talent into your organization. So. Moving forward, let's jump ahead to community. These are 3 more recommendations from the Eisner Foundation handbook. So once an organization has recruited and trained these new volunteers, you certainly don't want to lose them. Long-term volunteers will often say that they came for the cause, but they stayed for the people. And that doesn't necessarily mean the folks that they're serving. It may be the folks that they're working alongside. So because of that, building community is very important. There are a couple simple but impactful ways to approach this. The first is that nonprofits should encourage their staff to get to know your volunteers, even those who aren't working with them directly. Your volunteers need to feel like they're part of the fabric of the organization, and a good, healthy organization finds ways to introduce staff to volunteers and doesn't treat them as a separate population working for the organization. Next, make sure that there is enough downtime during volunteer shifts and have volunteers work in pairs or groups when possible. Simpler tasks like envelope stuffing or event setup can be much more enjoyable when people are allowed to converse and get to know each other. And finally, organizations need to find ways to express their appreciation socially for those volunteers that have come to them. Events don't have to be expensive, but they have to be thoughtful. We found that the volunteers were more likely to come back when they felt appreciated, and that can take the form of something as simple as a potluck, which makes volunteers feel respected and wanted and gives them a chance to chat while saving the organization on costs. So one of the organizations that we've worked with, and an organization that is fundamental to the Encore.org movement, is Jumpstart, and they've done a great job creating community within their volunteer cohorts. And I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle to talk about that at this point.
Thanks, Trent. I recently was in a conversation with someone who runs a program that brings volunteer drivers into the community to help people get to medical appointments and things like that. And their summer potluck apparently is the place to be on August 13th. So just to emphasize your point that sometimes just the opportunity to get together with people and share a recipe and hang out in the backyard is the best volunteer retention there is. And Jumpstart is a great example of a lot of different aspects of the importance of community to good volunteer training, retention, and again, back to older adult health in general, in terms of not just reducing social isolation, but really boosting a sense of intergenerational and multi-generational community. For those of you who might not know Jumpstart, this is an intensive early childhood literacy strategy that partners with preschools in several communities. They do have older adult volunteers. They call them the community core, which makes them a really terrific example of this aspect. And one of the things that I would love you to notice about this photo, if you can see it, is that people wear uniforms, in this case aprons, that are printed with Jumpstart. So part of the way that this program builds identity and community is by this sort of like common way of identifying yourself when you come into your assignment. And that gives people a sense of connection with one another, a sense of pride in their work. Another place I've seen this is in the Experience Corps in Philadelphia, which is was based for a long time at Temple University. And older African Americans in their 60s who got a Temple University badge as part of their association with the program were so proud of that piece of identity and community. And so another way that Jumpstart builds this identity and community for folks, if you look at the next slide, which Kat is going to give me. Thank you so much. Unlike Annette's story, everybody serves in teams. I've already emphasized in a couple ways the sense of identity that people get. You also see someone's badge in this background photo. They have regular professional development and social outings. And the last thing that emphasizes a point that Trent made earlier is that they have a kind of ambassador program, which is a way of asking for feedback throughout the year from the volunteers in order to improve the program. And this next slide is just a really powerful illustration to me of the way that serving in this program helps people feel not just connected, but healthier and more alive. Before I came into Jumpstart, I was very depressed. Jumpstart helped me survive. Those children helped me survive. Each year it gets better and better. This is my third year, and I'm hoping it'll be my fourth, because I want to keep coming back as long as I can. And this is a quote from a 75-year-old volunteer who you can see started in her early 70s and is still going strong. She wants to keep coming back as long as she can. And she started volunteering after her son died. And it's a frequent story that you'll hear, that people will come to volunteering in later life in a transition and make a commitment and make these connections that become extremely important to people in different ways. So if you look at the next slide, we have a really different, oh no, sorry, not a different kind of example, but back to Trent. Thank you. I got super excited about my example.
Sorry.
So Trent, it's back to you.
Sorry, I'm here. We all of a sudden we were on a different slide, and then it's back to my slide, and I'm adapting as we go along. So thank you so much, Michelle. So okay, so let's talk about our last three set of recommendations here, which is that while creating community is, of course, important for retention, so is keeping your volunteers comfortable. And these suggestions might not apply to all older volunteers. Everyone has different needs, and these don't necessarily correlate to someone's age. I know, I'll be the first one to tell you that that many senior volunteers are more vital, more lively than their younger counterparts. But please remember that we're not stereotyping here, but rather relying on recommendations from our grantees that have great volunteer programs. And we've asked them, what did you do to retain your volunteers? What did you do to keep them there to make your organization so successful? And many of them came back to us and said, you've got to spend extra time focusing on the comfort of your volunteers. You have to take into account their individual needs. So for some senior volunteers with vision or hearing challenges, organizations should make sure that they pay attention, be proactive about their workplace, make sure it's well lit, avoid stairs for those that might have trouble, and try to get them in a place without too much ambient noise. In doing so, we found that organizations find that many times all staff and all volunteers across the age spectrum benefit. Organizations also should take night driving into consideration as well. This can actually be quite helpful since volunteers with day jobs often need to come later in the day or on the weekend. So if you can get your older volunteers in there during the day by taking into account their night driving needs, that can be very helpful. But if you do need your older volunteers at night, this is where creating the community can come in handy. If volunteers have gotten to know each other, they'll be more comfortable carpooling, and this is even easier if recruiting efforts have been focused on the immediate area and no one has to go too far. And finally, and this is becoming increasingly less common, but still out there, and especially in rural communities, some older volunteers might not regularly access the internet. So many of us have gotten out of the habit of talking on the phone, but it's important to regularly reach out to volunteers to keep them up to date and engaged. And for some volunteers, this might mean setting aside time to call them. For the volunteers who are tech savvy, there's often a lot of work that they can do without having to leave home. And this also solves transportation problems if that's a concern. So we're going to go ahead and throw it right back to Michelle, who has a couple of great examples on how these recommendations have worked in her experience during the Encore.org Generation to Generation campaign.
Thanks, Trent. So now I get to introduce you to one of my favorite volunteers, Phil Waters from Generations Incorporated in Boston. She works with AARP Experience Corps. She actually has a really terrific career story, but for the sake of time, I will tell you that now Phil is a recruiting specialist for the AARP Experience Corps program in Boston. She started as a volunteer and now is a part-time paid staff person. Last year, she recruited 90 literacy tutors to serve children in Boston public schools. And many of the tutors that Phil recruits are residents from the same neighborhoods as the schools and after-school programs where they're serving children. So one of the ways that this particular program deals with transportation issues is they go really, really local. The other thing that Phil says about this that relates to comfort is that when she talks about the way that she recruits, she talks about the historic segregation, the racial segregation of the neighborhoods that older African Americans live in. So there's a place-based aspect of comfort that she also takes into account in terms of who's serving whom and who's reaching out in terms of recruiting. She does also note that some volunteers live on a fixed income. So if you're in a place where, for example, transit passes would be helpful, or it's possible for you to do mileage reimbursement, or as Trent mentioned, that you carpool in different ways. Rural communities, obviously will think different than urban communities will about this. So let's see, anything else about comfort? The other thing is just to emphasize the point that Trent made, that when you have older volunteers and when you have older and younger volunteers sometimes serving together, you might have older adults and college students, or older adults and millennial or Gen X professionals serving together. the kinds of accommodations that you might think about in terms of mobility and vision and hearing, they will often benefit everyone. I mean, you might have a younger volunteer who broke their ankle, and you need to think just as much about that as somebody in a wheelchair. So kind of a universal design approach to that. And then if you look at the next slide, I'm going to offer you a super different way of looking at who you might recruit and how you might help people feel more comfortable, which is to have folks who are doing a different kind of high impact volunteering that is not in person. So Table Wisdom is a new effort that actually won the Gen to Gen Encore Prize last year. We have a prize that is helping us identify and develop intergenerational innovations in different ways. And so Ray Castucciano is the founder, and Ray started Table Wisdom after observing his father, who's a Filipino immigrant, had to move into a nursing home. And Ray spent 6 weeks visiting his dad in this nursing home and saw a place that was filled with older adults who had lots of talents, lots of time to give, certainly, and lots of talent, but they were really isolated from one another and from the outside world. And so he started by wanting to help his dad and people like his dad regain a sense of purpose. And Ray and his father both had the experience of coming to the United States, not speaking a lot of English, and needing those skills for school and for work. So Table Wisdom pairs English-speaking older adults with college-age immigrants, and they have regular practice conversations on Skype if they can't be in person. And, you know, sometimes they'll meet for coffee one-on-one, but if you look at the next slide, you'll see an older white woman talking to a young person of color on her phone from her room, looking out the window, doing her volunteer work using this technology. And older adults gain a sense of purpose. Younger adults who are in the program gain a set of skills that they need and probably networks as a result of talking to a more experienced person living in their community and right down the street, even if they don't always meet in person. So that's just another way of thinking about how you might, first of all, broaden your outreach, and secondly, create an environment in which older adults can volunteer, even if, for example, they're homebound or living in an assisted living facility or a nursing home. This also, I think, really reminds us that older adults are using technology in different ways, and they can learn new ways of using technology. My 75-year-old mom cannot write an email with a subject line in it, but she is really adept at texting me a picture of whatever my niece is doing because she loves her iPhone and photos of the grandkids. And so if you have a motivation to learn a new technology, you will, and you can use it in ways like this. Trent, do you want to add anything to that about virtual volunteering?
Sorry. No, I do think that that oftentimes we talk about we need to have young people come work with older people on technology, and that can be a way that that intergenerational programs develop. But we also never embrace enough the fact that that older folks can use technology to do their volunteering, to connect, and to be a part of young people's lives. So technology is a broad, open topic, and something that can be utilized by all for many different purposes.
Thanks. And so I think now we're coming to a close. If you look at the next slide, I'm going to offer you a couple of resources and then hand it back to Trent. So There's lots more learning, obviously, available through the Eisner Handbook, which I know Trent will mention again in a minute, but also through the Gen2Gen Learning Hub, which is just at iamgen2gen.org/learning hub. And we've got both short videos and some written materials. I welcome all of you to take a look at whether you might be a good applicant for the Encore Prize, and you are welcome to write me with any questions. So Trent, back to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And you can see there that we too have what we think are good resources on our website. We'll leave that to the audience to determine, but you will see the full version of the handbook that we discussed today, Experienced Helping Hands. You know, it's really a kind of a common sense handbook, but it's based on a lot of really good research into organizations that have thriving intergenerational volunteer programs that have done that for the right reason, because they thought that that was an impactful way to bring about positive solutions for the folks that they serve. And so I think that it's a good handbook for not only funders, but for nonprofits that want to figure out how to better get more high-quality senior volunteers into their organization. So I also encourage those that are there to go ahead and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We try to stay active. We try to share what we know about intergenerational programming and about recruiting senior volunteers, and about ways to recruit teenagers to work with seniors, and anything where we can add 1 + 1 = 3 for the betterment of our society. So I'll wrap it there and turn it back over to John, I believe.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you so much, Trent and Michelle, for that wonderful presentation and hearing about the various programs, and particularly the guidance that you're giving through the handbook. It's now time for us to turn to the questions from our audience. And a reminder to our audience, you can still type in your questions in the question box that you see there on the right side of your screen, and I'll be asking those to our panelists at this point. So the first question is, we don't have a lot of volunteer opportunities evenly spaced throughout the year, which is obviously an issue for school-based programs in many places, but I don't know that that's the specific one here. How do we keep the relationship between us and our volunteers strong when we may not see them for months at a time? Michelle, do you have something to add about that one?
Sure. A couple of things come to mind. You don't mention in the question whether the program operates or the staff are around all year or not. So if it's not a school-based activity where the staff might be gone during a period of the year, you can keep reaching out to your volunteers just through like a quarterly written note, for example, or either email or handwritten snail mail. You might have social events during the times that volunteer opportunities aren't available, just to keep people connected. Those are two quick ideas.
Okay. Trent, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to tell people how to do their business, but I also think that potentially there's an opportunity to revisit what you need volunteers for. You know, we think of it traditionally just as, you know, as we see in the picture, we need an older guy to come in and play chess with the kid. But if we change that dynamic and we think of our volunteers as talent, perhaps there are other ways that you can put those folks to work throughout the year, whether that's helping with the organization, and whether that's, you know, helping with facilities or strategic planning or mentorship for current staff or any of those types of things. But really look at your volunteers as an asset, and not something that has to be satisfied with some mandatory activities. So, you know, I think there are opportunities to find ways to put folks to work a little bit more than perhaps some traditional organizations have.
Great reframe.
Thanks very much. The next question is, do you have advice for younger volunteer coordinators in handling older volunteers? And I think that probably is part of the general issue about training and how you continue to do the overall management of the volunteer program throughout the year. I'll let either
sure.
one of you take that one.
I'll jump in. I think that this basically is the crux of our handbook. So I would encourage the questioner to read the handbook, because it's basically that was what we were setting out to do, which is we met with a great deal of very high quality younger volunteer coordinators who had leveraged this great asset of older folks in their community for the betterment of their organization primarily. They weren't trying to bring in senior volunteers because they thought that would be good for the seniors. They were trying to figure out how, on a lean budget, how to bring talent into their organization. So I think that this is basically the gist of the handbook. But if I had to boil it down to one single recommendation, I just think it's about communication. I think, talking, emailing, sharing information, treating your volunteers as resources that can bring great talent to your organization, and not as something that has to be satisfied in some way or another, or a burden in some way or another, can really bring about positive change for the organization. And once you get those folks to buy into your vision and want to share their talents and expertise with you, I think you create a powerful team that can bring good things to the organization.
Great. Michelle, this is one that I will toss to you first. Do you have suggestions for integrating volunteer jobs and careers in the process of transitioning from full-time employment to a life of active retirement, particularly in using the workplace to help people do this? This is an issue that I know a lot of people are facing in terms of, they'd love to have some advice about how you would actually go about doing this stuff as they think about retirement, but mainly what they get is advice about financial issues, not about these kinds of issues.
Interesting. So John, is the question about making a transition from full-time work to more active volunteering? Is this how could we help people think about this phase of their lives, not just as a financial transition, but as a portfolio of time and money transition?
I think that's the gist of the issue. It's often a time when people think about this issue very specifically. How are they going to do something with their life that is going to be meaningful, and the role that their current employers might have in that process.
Mm-hmm. So I think there's a couple different ways to think about this. One, from an employer perspective, one of the benefits that you can offer to people as they reach a transition point in their late life career is to give people the flexibility to volunteer for something that they care about. You can think of it as an aspect of corporate social responsibility. You can think of it as a way of helping your organization to contribute to the community at the same time that you're helping employees make a strong transition out of a full-time career into some other kind of community role. From an individual perspective, you can also begin to think of this as your later life as a time and money portfolio, right? The clarifying question I asked, as you shift out of a full-time career, you might be making less money but doing something more satisfying, and you might be at a point in your life when you're able to do that for a variety of reasons relating to other transitions. You're no longer caring for children, you're no longer caring for parents, and you may have time and money to give to something that you've only volunteered for once a year before, and now you want to spend more of your time doing something that matters to you in a different way. Does that answer the gist of the question you got?
I think so. And it's certainly helpful advice in terms of this. I certainly know from my own experience as I sort of work on that transition myself, that the advice that you get is mainly about the nuts and bolts of either how to do things in terms of the retirement, or that you should think about how to broaden your horizons without really a whole lot of help in how you would actually do that. So, Trent, let's go back to you, and this one's about a more specific issue.
Can I just one sec, John?
Sure.
Can I just jump on that? And Michelle was just too modest to mention it, but I do think that that Encore fellowships are an amazing program that are out there that address some of these issues, which I encourage people, even if they don't want to apply to the program as they're transitioning out of their career into the next phase. If you read the material on their website, which I think is just at encorefellows.org, you really can find out a ton of really interesting information for people who are looking to transition. These are programs, and it's more popular in some cities than others, really thriving in the Bay Area. We're trying to get it off the ground well here in LA, where folks who are transitioning out of their careers can go and do part-time, in effect, internships where they get paid for 6 to 12 months to work in primarily nonprofit organizations, bringing their skills, their expertise to those organizations, but also it allows them to try to decide if this is the type of work they'd like to do in their Encore career. So they've done a lot of really great thinking around this, and trying to figure out what the next phase of one's life looks like. And I recommend that everybody refer folks to go ahead to Encore Fellowships and learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah, Trent, since you've, can I say one more thing about that, John? I know you're trying to move to the next question. Thank you for pitching the Encore Fellowships program, which can be a terrific opportunity in some cities, particularly for folks who are moving from corporate to nonprofit sector. The other thing that I want to mention that's, I think, more accessible to a wider group of people if you don't have Encore Fellowships in your city is Marcy Albaher's The Encore Career Handbook, which gives some super pragmatic advice, but also kind of helps people with the identity shift, John, that I think you're referring to. Okay, that's all on that question. Thanks.
Okay. Well, here's a very broad question, but I think a very important one, which is intergenerational programs are often talked about as nice. How do we make them essential? And I think that really captures a lot of issues in this particular issue. Do you want to start with that one, Trent?
Sure. And Michelle mentioned Temple University, which had the Intergenerational Center, and was the first recipient of the Eisner Prize for Intergenerational Excellence. And that organization was run by Nancy Henkin, who then went on to be a fellow at Generations United. And Nancy's mantra, as she pitched intergenerational programs nationwide, was, "They're not nice, they're necessary." And I think that's one of the reasons why we've entered this sector. We've all seen the cute visual. In fact, we're trotting one out right now of an older person and a younger person, and isn't that adorable, as one reads to the other and we connect the generations across ages and activities. But in reality, what we found in our work is that intergenerational programs are actually a more successful and more vital way to get to whatever it is that you're trying to achieve in society. We found that organizations, no matter what they want to do, whether it's providing health care to folks, or providing mentorship, or providing education, or anything, one of the really strong tools that can be utilized is to bring the generations together and utilize that talent. That's the whole point of this senior volunteer book that we created. It wasn't that it's a nice thing to do to recruit senior volunteers. We found that organizations that recruited senior volunteers got things done. The senior volunteers were in effect more patient. They were more understanding. They were more educated. They were more reliable. They're more likely to stay. And they're more likely to be there for the right reason. They're not worried about their resume. What they're trying to do is provide access and opportunity for those who deserve that in their lives. And oftentimes they have better skills than you would find if you hired somebody and paid them money to do that. These people have a real world, lifelong experience, skill set that they can call on. So I encourage everyone to look into intergenerational programming, to bringing more seniors into your organization, to bringing more kids into your organization, not because it creates good pictures, but because it is the best way to get things done.
Yeah.
Michelle?
Thank you. Yeah, if I can piggyback on that, I think those of us who know the power of intergenerational programming and have been looking at research and practice like Nancy Hankins and Nancy Morrow Howells and Linda Frieds for a long time need to learn to tell a different kind of story about this beautiful picture that we're looking at, right? Yes, this is a beautiful photo of an older man and a younger boy playing chess together. But I see a young man who has an older African-American role model in a community where there may be not as many fathers as we might wish who are present in young people's lives. I see a young person learning math and strategy. I don't play chess, right? Like, it's actually a pretty complex game. I see someone demonstrating a kind of caring that all young people need. So when we look at this photo, what do we draw people's attention to, and how do we then connect this image and the story that we tell to the most powerful research that's available about impact, as Trent called our attention to?
Well, great. I'm going to ask you one more technical issue, and then I'll ask you to give your final words of wisdom to our audience. So, Trent, we're talking about the handbook and the resources, and if we could go back one slide, I believe, to the resource page document. Tell us again what the name of the publication is and how they can find it on your website.
Geez, I don't have any idea what the name of the document is, John. You're just jumping in and hammering me right there. It's called Experienced Helping Hands, and it is available on our website at the web address that was one before this one, and I believe that is eisnerfoundation.org/handbook, and there is the evidence that this high quality webinar was not scripted in any way whatsoever, because I didn't even know the name of our own handbook without having to check as quickly as possible using technology. So, Experienced Helping Hands. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Trent. And yes, it's part of that CEO syndrome, you know. But anyway, we'll leave it there. Michelle, if we could ask you now to give us your final words of wisdom to our audience as we move to the end of the presentation today.
I just want to quickly say something that both John and Trent alluded to earlier, which is older adults are a tremendous source of talent for our organizations, not just in this one-on-one volunteering, the image that we're all looking at now, but working with groups of young people in schools, in community organizations as members of our staff and as specialized talent for projects and in year-long fellowship programs, helping us get a whole variety of things done in ways that they've shown themselves to be effective. So I just encourage everybody to look broadly and deeply at opportunities to use this tremendous source of talent in whatever you're trying to get done. And thanks again.
Thanks, Michelle. Trent?
I agree. I think that I would offer up basically just an amen to Michelle, which is I do think that we need to continue to address the easy narrative in this country that we have our older folks, our older population is a bunch of greedy geezers who are trying to tell people to stay off their lawn and stay away from their Social Security. We have, thanks to the changing demographics, we have an amazing cadre of highly qualified, experienced older folks in this community, in this nation, that should be treasured as resources and as assets that we can put to work to leverage high performance in our country. And we need to figure out ways to see seniors as folks that we need to bring about positive change in this country, and not as recipients of benefits.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank Michelle Hines and Trent Stamp for their wonderful presentation today and for all the work that they've done. We thank you and your organizations for all that you do to make life better for older adults and people of all ages. We also want to thank the John A. Hartford Foundation for their support of this program, which makes it available free of charge to everyone who is interested. We will be making this presentation available to anyone who wishes to view it later, and that includes both the slides and the audio. Please watch for a rebroadcast link on our website, www.giaging.org. Remember also that all of our webinars can be found on our YouTube site, so please go there if you're looking for others that are further back in time. We will be having another webinar coming up on June the 6th at 2 p.m. Called A Recipe for Success, Improving Care for People with Complex Health and Social Needs. And we have two outstanding individuals who will be presenting on that particular topic, which is of growing importance and interest to the field nationally. And finally, I want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. Have a great day.